everybody, welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Landon.
And you may notice, it may not have escaped you that we are in a different location, aren't we, than our normal studios.
Does not look like your normal bookcase book thing, but we are talking books today.
We're talking books, that's right. And the other thing missing here is the dogs that we have between us that are always on the couch and we're always having to push them off and pet them. No, we are in a professional setting now. We are at Signature Books, and we're here for a very special reason and for very special people. We are here with the director of Signature Books, Barbara Brown. How are you today, Barbara?
Great. Thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, we are excited. Every time we podcast here, really good and exciting things happen, don't they? They do.
We like what Barbara brings.
We like what Barbara brings to this table, that's right. And the reason that we're here today and our very special guest is Laurie Lee Hall. How are you today?
Doing great, and I'm so glad to bring this together, have this happen.
No, it's really fun. We just actually all went out to dinner, didn't we?
We did.
That was really fun. And we had this extremely wonderful conversation, and as I was driving back, I said to Landon, why don't we just record that, honestly? The good stuff happens, right, when you're out to dinner and you're just chatting at a table.
Certainly.
Yep, I think so too. But we are here to talk about a brand new book that Signature Books is putting out. Everybody hold up your book. Here we go. This is an amazing new book, and the actual date that it's coming out, Barbara,
is November 20th, Transgender Awareness Day.
Transgender Awareness Day. And the book is called Dictates of Conscience, From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman, by our special guest, Laurie Lee Hall. And we are just absolutely thrilled. We knew that this was coming out. Barbara had been telling us that this was in the works. I can't even remember when you first mentioned it. It was a while ago, and you said, you won't believe what we're working on. This is gonna be amazing. I kind of made a mental note. I think you knew about it too. But this is really exciting. And I know that you've been going around talking to a lot of different people, and you have book talks and book signings, all kinds of things coming up. So we're really happy that you have some time to talk to us tonight.
That's great, thank you.
This will be good, yeah. And I should mention, this is so funny. We're here at the wonderful Signature Book Studios, and there's a train that runs right behind us. If you remember our podcast with the wonderful Moshe Quinn, we kind of had that same thing going on. So if you hear a little rumbling, or you see us shaking a little bit or pausing, don't be alarmed, there's nothing wrong with us. It's a train that's going through in the background. So we will work around this, but we're really excited. If you guys could see this setting, I mean, just full of books. This is like my happy place. So it's really wonderful.
It's a great setting, that's for sure.
Yep, it really is. So I think we'll get started. And I guess my first question would be so many. How did this project even begin? Whose idea? Did you approach Barbara? Did Barbara approach you? How did this even become a reality?
2.5 years ago, I began bringing together all the parts and pieces of journals and letters and other source documents with a desire to prepare a memoir. And I'm not a professional writer. That's not my gig. I was trained to be an architect.
You are now. No, and this is beautifully written. It is beautifully written.
Thank you.
I mean, it really is.
The reality is, on that topic, I threw as much as I could down on the table, had an early manuscript of 140,000 words, and an extremely talented editor. In terms of who approached who, that began with our talking to Greg Prince to say, I've got this coming together. I want to do this book. It's meaningful, it's important to me. Greg, how would you proceed if you were me, knowing that he has successfully put some books out that are very useful and important? And he's very thoughtful. He stopped and thought for a bit, and he thought, Barbara Jones Brown has just become the director over at Signature Books, and I bet she might like to help you tell this story. And so he introduced us, and we asked Barbara at that point if she would be interested in taking on my story. And the answer was?
Absolutely.
No hesitation.
The first time we met was actually at a Sunstone conference when we met in person.
Yeah, first time in person.
Yeah, and we went to lunch together, and I was just fascinated by Laurie Lee's story. I had heard of Laurie Lee in 2017 when there was a front page article about her in the Salt Lake Tribune. After she had been excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for transitioning and living authentically as the woman she's always been. And I remember reading that story, not knowing Laurie yet, but thinking, what an incredibly brave individual to do what she's doing. And so I admired her bravery and her courage. And so when I got to meet her the first time, it was really exciting. And the more and more I learned her story, just talking with her, I was fascinated with it. And then being able to edit her story and work so closely with her to bring the story to life in the form of a book has been a great privilege and an honor for me. And I've enjoyed it so much. I love this book. I love Laurie's story.
Thank you, Barbara. It's I think that first lunch was actually a lunch meeting that lasted about 3 hours.
Was it 3 hours?
I think so.
I didn't even notice. It was so
Time
interesting.
went like that.
I think that first luncheon, I'm not even sure I finished my meal. It ran 3 hours, and I was just full of joy for sharing details of my story with you. And then I think we got in the car and we were headed someplace together, and you started asking questions that helped me to realize, just minutes after we'd had that lunch meeting, that I really needed a person like Barbara to make my story come to life. And most importantly, she had a great perspective on feminine issues in the church. And she asked me what it was like to hold the priesthood and priesthood keys as a woman. And I thought, this is good. This is what my story needs. There's no man who's going to be able to ask these questions effectively like a woman editor would. And Barbara volunteered herself to be the content editor and ultimately the book editor for the entire book. So many of my stories were in thematic essay type as opposed to in a memoir. And Barbara coached me, as dense as I was about what she was trying to have me do, to peel apart all those thematic essays that I had formed into chapters and arrange them chronologically and give them the voice of a memoir. And that was quite a learning experience for me. But the results, which blew my mind, how effective it became. We talk about it as concentrated orange juice. There's something major happening on every page of this book.
There is, and it has such a wonderful flow to it. That's one thing that really struck me. And now I'm starting to understand, now that I understand the collaboration between the two of you. But yeah, just a flow and a poetry to it, which, not to give a spoiler, but at the end we will be talking more about poetry. One thing I want to do really quickly though is, we've all been talking as friends, we've gone out to dinner, it's so conversational. I completely forgot, everyone, that we usually start out Mormonish by reading a bio, and we do have Laurie Lee's bio here, but I just jumped right into the conversation because we've been having such a kind of an ongoing for hours. So I'll break a little bit of format here. Landon, of course, as you know, is our official bio reader, but just so that we can have more of an understanding as we dive into all of this, let's go through this really quick. This is her bio on the signature webpage. So let's just read this really quick and then we'll dive back into the conversation.
Yeah, and this story becomes way more fascinating when you understand who she is.
Yes.
Because this is a great story. Laurie Lee Hall's growing up years were defined by the conflict between her physical condition as a boy and her inherent identity as a girl. Unable to explain or resolve her gender dysphoria, she committed to living her adult life as a male. She joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, eventually becoming chief architect of its temples and an ecclesiastical leader. In her church and community, rigid adherence to gender roles is not only the norm, but the defining issue of a faith that doctrinally declares one's gender as an eternal identity. Against this traditional backdrop, Hall finally received spiritual confirmation and personally accepted that she was transgender and always had been. In this remarkable memoir, Laurie Lee details how she risked everything to live true to her long-suppressed gender identity. Through the power of lived experience, Laurie Lee's story affirms the reality of gender identity and the strength and joy of self-acceptance. So, and I don't think we mentioned it, as an ecclesiastical leader, you were bishop and stake president.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Yeah. those perspectives. That's just incredible.
And Temple Architect.
And Temple Architect. There you have it. Now you understand why we're so excited to talk to Laurie Lee. This is just amazing. So tell us a little bit to begin with your process. Did you sit down? Did you have your computer? And did you, or were you able, was it flowing? I mean, some people, it can go either way, right? Sometimes
Right.
it's very easy. Other times you really overthink. I mean, like I said, such a flow, such a poetry to this book. I just picture you just without an editor writing every single page, but I know that's not how it works.
And yeah, no, I like I said, I wrote 140,000 words, which is almost twice as much as the book actually contains. It was a process of storytelling for me initially, and as I mentioned, the stories kind of followed themes, and that's how they got created as chapters. I captured first the telling of the tale of my excommunication, the actual church disciplinary council, and I thought those might be chapters 1 and 2, and we'd start there. But eventually we left just a little of that up front and put the disciplinary council where it needed to be in 2017. I would think more about my stories that I probably spent time writing. And I found old letters, I found my journal notes, I looked at pictures, anything that could help bring back my memory on certain things. But in writing, and also in Barbara questioning my circumstances at a given point in time, we exhumed a whole bunch of memories and even some trauma that I had no recollection of at the surface. And the memoir process was just a wonderful way to kind of get out all these stories and see them, and then start connecting the dots of, well, that happened and this happened, and then that allowed this to happen. And when I lived through those things, I didn't see that A to B to C kind of relationship. But looking back now, we were able to structure those stories in such a way that the meaning and the connection is so much clearer than I ever felt before. And I cried through this. I had to process trauma through this. I found joy in realizing what triumphs occurred, and it was. But as far as formal writing process, I don't have a formal writing process. When I felt kind of the idea trying to bust out of my brain, I would sit down and start typing. But it happened at all different times in the day. Sometimes it wouldn't happen for a couple of days. I was as undisciplined as probably any writer ever has been. And but over the course of maybe 15 months, the whole draft manuscript was written out. And then Barbara had me chapter by chapter put them on a Google Doc that were in a Google file. And that was frightening to me because I knew nothing about how to use Google Docs. And once I started to, I really didn't like it.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like a place where I could creatively write. But
it's an editor's dream.
So that's it, exactly.
Once
And you'll never lose it, right? You'll never hit the wrong button,
and
it
then
all
you can
disappears.
have in the right column,
Exactly.
conversations about what's going on in the main
Yeah.
text together.
And as editing began, that became totally apparent that it was the right tool. And I've learned how to use it now. And that's a skill I'll take with me
For your next book.
for my next book, which will be coming out now. We won't make that,
An announcement, right?
we won't make that prediction right now.
So what made you decide that to tell this story? I mean, obviously, when you're a bishop, a stake president, church architect, that there's this point where, and I think when we were at dinner, you even said that you lost a lot of friends as a result of this, a lot of colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times you want to just kind of run away from that and not address that issue, but you came out and said, I'm going to write a book about it. What was it that led you or really drove you to say, I want to write my story and tell this story?
Well, I think, Landon, that if I had served as a bishop and a stake president and even the chief architect for the church, that wouldn't make a very interesting story.
Lots of those.
Other people live those stories as well, and it might be an interesting thing that I could put in my family history for my posterity to read the escapades that I had been involved with. But the intersection of all of those things that I did in Mormonism at really high levels, and the fact that in the middle of it all, I couldn't suppress my gender identity any longer, and that starting in 2012, a dozen years ago, I began interfacing with the senior leaders of the church with whom I worked and who oversaw my ecclesiastical work, because they found out I considered myself transgender. And the combination of all of those experiences, multiple hot buttons in this day and age, curiosity about the Mormon church, all of the political mayhem that's taking place over the transgender experience, even issues associated with bodily autonomy. Do I get to make changes to my body to align with my gender identity? These are things that are being pressed right now in legislature, and even the Supreme Court is taking up a major case this session. When I began writing, I started seeing this onslaught of anti-trans legislation taking place. I saw the great interest that seemed to be ongoing. The Mormon moment in 2012, when Mitt Romney was the candidate for president, that Mormon moment seems to be continuing as well. But I think the combination of all my experiences helped me overcome the idea that I wasn't just going to fade into the woodwork and walk around in the world of cisgender women and try to blend in, but instead that gave me a responsibility to use my voice to share a story which I think is quite interesting and powerful. Barbara and I have learned that and talked about the fact that stories have great power in them, the sharing of stories, that stories can change hearts. And we've talked about the fact that we believe that this memoir, because of the places I go in it and talk about and the happy and hopeful ending that it has, will be a book that sheds light on a pathway forward for lots of people and potentially can save some lives. So driven by that passion to do some good and to believe that the story was interesting enough and complex enough to really help and make a difference. And in the process, I'm shining the light on things that happened with the church, and just how challenging it is to be a transgender person in or out of a church. It's all there. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say that this is why I wanted to publish Laurie's story, because we share that same goal. We want to help people, and ultimately we believe this book will save some lives, beyond just helping others have happier lives. We believe it will literally save some lives. And for me, as a straight cisgender woman, not knowing much about the transgender experience before, my friendship with Laurie and having the opportunity to edit her story, I have learned so much. I'm so grateful for that, and I hope that through publishing this book and sharing it, so many other people like me who just want to learn more about the transgender experience. Maybe we have a transgender child or a transgender family member or friend. We can learn so much through Laurie's book and just reading her experiences that she shares here.
There's a lot of negative publicity and negative political speech towards transgender people. A lot of folks are being exposed to a very false narrative regarding what trans people are up to, whether we're dangerous, whether we can be trusted. And we'll talk perhaps a little later about the stance that the church has taken regarding transgender members, but we're the latest boogeyman, if you will, in both church circles and not just the Latter-day Saint Church, but the high demand religions in general are having their transgender experiences, try to figure out what to do with us. And we also include some examples in here of my own experiences with church members and in certain communities of the LDS Church that actually got it right and showed me acceptance and love in ways that really should be doable everywhere.
Yeah, I saw that in the book too, which was amazing. And I think, we'll pause right there for a second. And I think that this book honestly couldn't have come out at a better time, because as you're alluding to, and we can probably just touch on that now, there have been some policies that have been clarified in the handbook and things like that about, transgender members of the church that a lot of people are confused by, people are upset, they're seen as very harmful. And so what you just said, Barbara, to read a book, to read a story, to not have someone be, oh, that's them, right? That's the idea. No, that's not them. That's Laurie Lee. That's everyone else that you may know in your ward or your family. And that's what this book does. It's so accessible, I think. So obviously when you were writing it, you didn't know that these policies were going to come, or the handbook changes would come out. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that in relation to your book coming out, but I think the timing is absolutely perfect.
So the timing is really remarkable, Rebecca, because we were literally putting the final touches on the last chapter in August of this year, when on Monday, August 19th, 2024, the church dropped online these new restrictive policies towards transgender members of the church. We pumped the brakes and said, we've got to address this. We worked on our afterword to include some succinct statements with regard to that new policy, but in doing so, it set us a little bit backwards from the date we were planning on having the book out. As terrible as the policy restrictions are, I'm grateful that it happened when it did, if it was going to happen, so that we could address it. Because I really believe dictates of conscience, working with a historian, becomes a pretty important history of the Latter-day Saints and gender identity, and the clash over gender identity taking place in this part of the 21st century. It becomes the history of that circumstance. And to miss that major milestone, as gruesome as it is, would have been less.
I frequently told Laurie that this book is the first chapter of transgender history in the LDS Church.
You work very closely with high general authorities, First Presidency even. When they learned that you were trans, how was that received, and did you ever have hope that, oh, well, maybe this will be a positive change, maybe they're accepting now, they know who I am, they know me, maybe they'll ask some questions? Did they ever try to learn from you, or was it the opposite, you just were pushed away?
So somewhere in between, and it took some time, but in the book I detail in a number of chapters the very specific meetings I had with several general authorities. And this was, again, 12 years ago in 2012, long before Dallin Oaks said in an interview with the Tribune that that issue is a transgender issue. We don't know much about that. So 2.5 years prior to President Oaks saying, we don't know much about transgender. And it was the first time I'd ever heard a general authority use the word transgender. So 2.5 years before he said that, I was sitting down and meeting with presiding Bishop Gary E. Stevenson, who's now in the Quorum of the 12, with L. Whitney Clayton, who was the president of the 7 presidents of the 70 at the time. They were counseling with regard to my ecclesiastical calling with President Boyd K. Packer of the Quorum of the 12, with whom I had just spent 4 years meeting individually, myself and President Packer, on the design and construction of the Brigham City Temple in his hometown. Just the very next month after he dedicated that temple, he and Elder Clayton took my agenda item to the meeting of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple to present the fact that we've got this stake president in Tooele, Utah, who feels they are transgender. And what are we going to do about this person? And the word came back from that meeting that we'll release our stake president because I had 8.5 years in at that point, and that was a reasonable amount of time. And they would do so in an honorable way as opposed to a punitive way, which I was grateful for the sake of our congregations. The very next day, Presiding Bishop Stevenson met with the First Presidency and discussed whether I should remain a church employee or not. And both of those things were bombarding me as I was having these ongoing meetings with the general authorities. Bishop Stevenson came back and met with me, and or of course I met with him, and told me that the First Presidency was very pleased with the work that I was doing for them. I met with the First Presidency at that point over the course of 4 years on a monthly basis to make presentations of the temple designs and provide an update of the progress of each of the temples under construction. So the First Presidency and several other senior general authorities knew me very well. I walked the halls of the administration building. They knew me by name, and the First Presidency said, we really like the work that Brother Hall is doing, and we would like him to remain an employee so long as there's a current temple recommend. So there was a compliment and a challenge to stay worthy, of course, and that was really reassuring. So those two meetings took place, the one in the temple and the one with the First Presidency. Those took place on Thursday and a Friday. The following Thursday was my presentation for the month to the First Presidency. And I went to that meeting early and made sure everything was set up properly, like I had done some 50 times before, but knowing that today was going to be different because when they walked into the room, they knew they were walking into a room with their transgender chief architect. And that was undeniable. Yeah. So I describe in the book what actually happened just prior to that meeting starting. Appearing at the door early as well to the meeting was President Uchtdorf, was the second counselor in the First Presidency at that time. And rather than going to the head of the table to sit down next to where President Monson would be seated, he went around the table the other way so that he could approach me. And, again, I'm watching for what's going to happen next. He puts his arms around me and pulls me close to him, tight close to him, puts the other arm around me, so I'm in, kind of this bear hug from this, although elderly man, a very fit and strong man. And as he pulled me close to him, he said, "We are so very grateful that you are with us at this time." And I melted into him. I just turned into my little puddle of tears in his arms. It was such a lovely expression of love after several weeks of feeling like I was really on the bubble at that point. I'd been outed, in the worst way, potentially to send my career and my service in the church and probably many other things crashing on the rocks. And so I got a release out of it, which was actually a great relief. And I was welcomed to stay as an employee, but with constraints. And if you'd like to hear about those constraints, I could talk about those a little bit.
And you were married at this time.
Yep, I'd been married about 25 years at that point. Had 5 children. Most of my children at that point were adults and were married. Had grandchildren on the way at that point.
Mm. But they knew who you were. They knew the scenario.
By that point, I had come out to all of them and their spouses and family and so forth. The constraints that Bishop Stevenson identified to me was really interesting because as he worked with me, I felt his heart and his love and his interest in my circumstances and in the broader sense, what it means to be transgender. He seemed to be really interested in learning about that. But he had this other personality, which was, I think, driven by General Counsel of the Church and the Human Resource Law, where he had to say things to me that he wasn't even comfortable saying, but it had to be that way, and he had to put those things in writing. And basically, they locked down my behavior 24/7 if I wanted to remain a church employee. And that, to me, was the day that I began to work as an employee under probation. And that went on for almost four more years. Yeah.
And you were designing temples at that time
Still
during those 4
still-
years?
still designing
and the
temples.
MTC project, I didn't realize that
Yeah.
until I read your
Ultimately.
book, that was also you, so, my goodness.
What were some of the constraints as far as, I mean, to say that you had to maintain a temple recommend, and now we read some of the, the
Yeah.
things that just came out, they would say you're not worthy of a temple recommend just by the fact
Just by
that,
being you.
just by being
Just
you.
by being
Yeah.
me.
So
At
did this
that-
develop over time? Did they add, or were they getting you right up?
Everything developed over time because they were still trying to figure it out as well. I was ahead of the curve on their learning. And I think something, Landon, that you said earlier, that I may have had some sense that I was in a position where I could help make a difference in their understanding on the subject. And I do describe in the book how, through a spiritual experience where I studied the story of Esther and how she saved her people because she had the courage to go to the king and tell the truth so that her people would be saved. And the great line in that story that says, "Perhaps you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this," resonated with me. I thought, well, I'm in a position where the brethren know me better than any other transgender person that I could possibly be aware of. And if they wanted to learn about this, perhaps I was brought to the kingdom to teach it. And I tried, and the idea that they could have called me over at any point in time and sat me down and said, "Now help us understand this," as opposed to telling me, "Here come the constraints. Never wear an article of women's clothing."
Even at home.
Even at home, 24/7. Do not participate in any online groups, forums, therapy sessions, whatever. Seek therapy from only doctrinally aligned LDS therapists, which was non-existent at the time. There weren't any that knew how to
Yeah, where would you find that?
work with gender identity at that time. And I already had a great therapist who happened to not be LDS. Another constraints. I had to stop blogging about my feelings. I was blogging in a pseudonym in an attempt to find other Latter-day Saints who were transgender. I actually did find several. And the fifth one was never speak of these matters at work to any church employees, because it might be viewed as a sexual harassment situation that might offend someone. Yeah.
Boy, that's
every
kind of
part-
a one-way street.
I was going to say, every part of you was completely shut down. I mean,
Exactly.
it could not be you
I could
at
not be
all
me.
in any way, even at home.
And it's so,
I just-
I know the whole thing
The
is so ironic.
home.
Like, Rebecca, you and I'm sure sometimes, like, I love wearing masculine clothing.
Of course. why not?
Sometimes I'll wear my husband's t-shirts or
Yep.
something like that, But
Yeah.
so what was wrong with Laurie Lee if she wanted to wear something feminine when she's
And who would know?
at home?
Unless there were cameras in the house. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
I like to wear ugly shirts.
I'm sure I felt that way.
Absolutely
I just-
felt that way. And so Bishop Stevenson asked me, "Can you abide by these constraints?" And I said, "This is going to be hard," because at that point I had already proven that I could mitigate to some degree the gender dysphoria that I felt by doing the things that they were telling me not to do anymore. So I knew there was going to be an increase in this feeling of gender dysphoria for as long as I tried to keep those constraints. Over the next 3 years, I managed to break all 5. And the breaking of those, should anyone have come and asked about it, would have been plenty cause, because they had it in writing, that I could have been terminated on any given day.
On the spot.
On the spot. So The last of the constraints that I broke was in April of 2016. A coworker sent out an email, very inappropriate email, to all of the directors of our department in physical facilities that poked fun at an all-gender restroom and made some anti-trans remarks. And I was preparing for work when I saw this pop up on my phone, and I said, oh, I kind of sat down for a second and thought about it, and I thought, well, I have a choice to make. If I just forget about this, I'm going to watch all day as my work colleagues in the department chime in and offer their own thoughts, inappropriate as they might be, and that's going to hurt me. And then I thought, well, if I push back on it quickly, maybe it can get shut down, but in doing so, I am going to be breaking that fifth constraint in a public enough way that I'm outing myself to the department. I chose the latter, and I wrote a very succinct reply, knowing that if I hurried, it would be the next thing that popped up in everyone's email would be this reply to what had just been sent. And I corrected what was said in a couple of succinct sentences, and then I said, perhaps you don't think you know anyone who's transgender, but now you do.
Oh, wow.
And 30 minutes later, when I got to the office, all eyes were upon me, and I was immediately called into my boss's office with the human resource director, and we had a very frank discussion about the fact that I was trans, and that now the whole office knew. But that was the thing that Bishop Stevenson had told me not to do, in a big way. So by that point, I was out at work. The interesting thing was a lot of the folks who had worked with me over the years came and visited my office one at a time during the course of that day, and most expressed their interest, their appreciation for my honesty and concern for my safety and my situation. It was really kind of a positive outing experience. I was aware of one other transgender person who had worked on that same floor probably 12, 15 years earlier, who arrived at work not in a suit and tie, but in her female clothing. And within minutes, security was escorting her out of the building, never to return. So I fully expected that if I went fast, I'd have to pick up my personal belongings and I was going to get escorted out of the building. And it didn't turn out that way, thankfully.
And so you continued.
I continued
as an
then for
employee, but
another
never
6
did.
months
Another 6 months.
after I outed myself. And I probably could have continued longer as an employee if I hadn't continued pushing buttons.
Yeah, you mean being yourself. And I feel like
myself.
the part of this where you say people came to me individually and said, tell me about you, the real you kind of see. I feel like that's the church in general. I think one-on-one in the wards, people are very loving and they want to know, they want to learn, they don't know and they want to know. But then there's the institution, right? And they're caught between that.
Right.
And just like you really are this sort of example here of I think what a lot of people are going through. So I love that they came to you, even though in that scenario, their job perhaps could have been questioned if they show some kind of allegiance or alliance to their friend. But I think we see that more and more in wards and stakes everywhere, where the ward members stand up and say, this is not some random person. This is not a policy that affects no one. This is my friend. And that's what something like your book helps people understand, and just you being you. So anyway, that kind of gives me goosebumps. That's amazing that you would find that in the church office building. And it's a lesson to all of us, because we tend to think, oh, they're all, but they're not all, you know what I mean? They're in an institution too, and they have to play their part. So very interesting.
That was something that I brought up with Laurie again as I was editing her story. And there's some beautiful stories of people who were supportive of Laurie throughout the entire book. And what I came to observe editing it was people at the local level, for the most part, there's exceptions, but are just beautiful and wonderful and supportive of Laurie, her bishops, her friends, her Relief Society president, her administrative assistant at work. I mean, there's just countless stories, other colleagues. And it was like you said, it was like at the state president level and above, that institutional level and above, where she was having the pushback and the trauma.
That's what surprised me, because if this happened in any other company that's not a religion, the person sending out the original email would have been the person who would have been disciplined. And because you're a religious organization, you're allowed to treat people that way. Inappropriately.
He was entirely out of line.
Yeah.
Totally violated our office policies regarding the use of email.
Yeah.
Did
in
he
doing
receive
so.
any pushback?
And I'm not
from that?
aware that he received any
my
pushback, as inappropriate as it is. But the church, my youngest son told me this on Sunday, the church works really well for straight, white, cisgender males.
Yeah.
And
100%.
I worked with a bunch of them.
Those were your colleagues. In your book, I remember that you mentioned, I think you were sitting in church with Nancy, and there was a mission president, a new mission president, and like you said, it seems like the higher up you go, the more, whether they're playing a part, maybe they fit the suit in some cases and they can't express what they really would, or really they are like that. But he definitely, you sense some disdain perhaps, or
total unstoppable animosity.
Yeah.
And
just because of your presence, just because of who you are.
And because I happened to be sitting with two of his sister missionaries at the time in Sacramento.
With Nancy,
and we were sharing a hymn book, and it was like, there's this, woman on woman couple, with the sister missionaries. What are we going to do to those poor sisters, Yeah. We were very dangerous, but that may have been the last time we visited our ward. Our ward at times have been very good, but that experience was kind of the end of the road, because it just doesn't work going to worship in a place that becomes so toxic.
And were the sister missionaries uncomfortable?
No, they'd been to our house several times. They had actually heard my whole story, because when we got a hold of them, it was like captive audience, and Nancy particularly would share, do you know who this is that you're sitting with? And their eyes would get really wide, and we'd tell them these things, and they at that time were really quite friendly to us, and they loved our stories. And after that time, it was clear that somebody gave the message, don't visit that household anymore, because the visits stopped.
We got to fix that. They're not bigoted enough.
That's right. They're having too much fun with Nancy and Laurie. We can't have that.
The leader saw Laurie as dangerous.
Yes.
Which of course she's not.
That's exactly right. Just by existing, there's danger there, and that's what's. So now that you have us all riveted here, so you continued at your work for 6 more months, and then what finally changed? How did this?
Yeah, the situation that was occurring in my life at that time, I had been on hormone replacement therapy for about 2 years at that point, and that had really brought me into a much better place emotionally and mentally. And there's even a photograph in the book of a suit and tie clad version of me in April of 2016 with just a gaping big happy smile on my face, and it was because I was really enjoying life at that point, although I had to continue presenting as male during the day at work. I was feeling so much better about myself at that point.
And your hair's a little longer.
My hair was a little longer, and it was actually fuller than it is anymore. Age is catching up with us. But the thing that happened through the course of that summer was it was becoming harder and harder to make the gender switch every day. Wake up, feeling like myself, putting on the suit and tie, and the male presentation was feeling more and more offensive to my spirit, and then playing that role until I could leave the church office building and rip my tie off and kick my dress shoes off and just, try to be me again in the evening. That was getting to be too hard, and it came to a climax one Sunday morning in which I was supposed to go teach gospel doctrine that day, and I was trying to put my tie on, and I just looked at myself in the mirror and said, enough. I cannot do this anymore. And I didn't make it to church that day. I was really quite scrambled. And my good bishop came over and met with me. And I said, Bishop, it's time. I have got to come out and start living authentically, at least here in Tooele. And so he worked with me, very much an advocate in my case. He worked with me to do an unmistakable coming out opportunity the first Sunday in July at Fast and Testimony meeting. And he was conducting that session. He gave a beautiful set of remarks about inclusivity and acceptance and so forth as part of his testimony. And I made sure that as he turned head to his seat, that I was on the stand and at the rostrum as quickly as I could be, so that I could pick up on his remarks and the spirit of his comments. And I outed myself to the congregation, which basically outed myself to the valley.
It's a small valley.
So, yeah, stories travel quickly. And from then on, I could safely, in my estimation, I could safely go about my life away from the office as my authentic self.
And this was her congregation where she had served as bishop and stake president for years.
Yes.
Many
We
years.
had lived there.
These are your people.
We had lived there just about 20 years at that point. And these people all knew me well. And the interesting thing was the comments split roughly 50-50 from our ward members. There were some people who came up to me afterwards and embraced me. All of them were women. And many of them were single sisters and widows and so forth that I had worked with a lot and given a lot of time and energy to help them in their circumstances. Some people declared that it was the most spiritual sacrament meeting they had been to in years. And others said it was the greatest abomination they'd ever seen in a church building. And immediately went to the stake president and complained, wrote letters to church headquarters and complained. It was very interesting to see how that went. After coming out, I had to walk down the hall and teach gospel doctrine class.
Oh, wow.
And I noticed that a lot of the folks who normally came to that class didn't come that day. And yet the room was full of people who I'd never seen before in gospel doctrine class. It was just, it's that kind of mixed reaction that can occur. That was the last time I taught that class in a suit and tie. The following week, I taught that class dressed as me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the challenge was I was still going to work presenting as male, but it became more and more difficult, but also considerably flimsier because it was getting to be well known that that wasn't me anymore. Several times my department managing director tried to set up a meeting with me, and I could tell he was very anxious about having to deal with this issue, and I knew what he was concerned about. But I had made a commitment that before I left employment from the church office building, if that was going to be the case, that I would ask a very important question. And so when he finally got me in his office in the month of August, about 6 weeks after I'd originally come out, and he said, "Where is this going?" I said to him, "The only thing I want to know is if the church that helped write the Utah Compromise, which protected transgender and LGBT people in their employment and in their housing, if the church would honor the spirit of that law, even though they had written in their own loophole, and recognize the ethical, moral, and medical appropriateness of supporting an employee in transition. I want to know, not from a middle manager, but from the Church Human Resources Committee, which was the first presidency level committee that set policy. I want to know if I will be supported through my transition, which is already well underway, and remain an employee." And I promised him that I would be able to function as an even more effective employee once I was no longer wrestling with gender dysphoria, because I could live authentically and just be more effective as an employee.
And not just any employee.
Yeah.
Chief architect
Yes.
for the church is
Yes.
creating these amazing temples
They
and
can't lose
amazing
you. Yeah.
projects.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much. that Laurie Lee was contributing to the church?
So again, if there was a Queen Esther, I was it.
Yeah.
And that was the question that needed to be asked at that time as I went before the king. And the human resource director in the room was very flustered.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And started to stammer an answer, and he got cut off by my boss, who said, "I'll get it asked." And I thought,
Wow.
okay, message sent, message received.
You are pushing that envelope
I pushed
as
that
it
envelope.
needs to be pushed. And as you
Exactly.
said, you were the only one that could.
And
You really were at that time.
I was
in that position.
in
you
that
were
position.
the only one.
I was aware of other gay, lesbian, and transgender people at work,
Mhm.
but none of them had the name, face recognition that I had been able to achieve.
Yep.
So that was on a Friday when I asked that question. Following Tuesday, my stake president called me into his office and said, "I need to cancel your recommend." Now, canceling a temple recommend immediately disqualifies the person from being able to
Yeah.
work at church headquarters.
Yeah.
And there was already a case back in the early 90s where the church won the right to demand a temple recommend as a qualification for employment. So because my new stake president had been my former first or second counselor, I said, "President, you and I both know the temple recommend questions by heart.
Yeah.
Let's do an interview." And
Yeah.
so I, for the next hour, interviewed myself. I'd ask the questions and then I'd give a thorough answer. And he just sat back in his chair, my old chair, and finally said, after the 15th question had been satisfactorily answered, he said, "I see no reason to take away your temple recommend."
Yeah.
I stood up and said, "Thank you, President. Have a good night." Went home grateful that I was able to face that situation and secure my continuation. 48 hours later, I get called by the stake president again, and I'm back in his office as though he had never left. And he said, "I'm taking away your temple recommend." And at that point, I had confirmation as to what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been a coincidence the first time. The second time, it was clear that he had received instructions from above
Yeah.
to cancel my recommend, to disqualify me, so they would never have to deal with the question that I asked
Yep.
or my desire to transition. I would just be pushed out for ecclesiastic reasons. And that time, when he said it the second time that we have to cancel your recommend, I just sat quietly and didn't say a word, didn't bat an eye. And it made him so uncomfortable that he rambled for about 20 minutes, backpedaling and saying all kinds of things. And finally he said, "Aren't you going to say anything?" Because I've been very vocal the previous night.
As if, what could you say?
What could I say
mean,
at that
you know
point?
what's going on.
I know
He
exactly
knows
what's going on.
He's playing his part, and
Yeah.
he's going to do it.
He'd been threatened, probably
Yeah.
with his calling being
Yeah.
released,
Mhm.
his status in the church
Yep.
being removed. So I stood up and I said, "This is unjust, President," and I turned and walked out. And because of that, I prepared my intent to retire letter and made sure it was on my boss's desk the next morning, because I could have been terminated that next morning for not having my temple recommend.
So retire before
And so-
termination. Yeah.
All of this was part of the grand plan. If I could survive the process of gender transition until I hit that critical moment when I had been an employee for 20 years and was 55 years old, I could at least salvage some retirement benefits. And so I gave my retirement letter to him and avoided or robbed them of the opportunity to just fire me and therefore lose all of my benefits that I had.
Can I ask you
Yeah,
about
please.
the stake president and the bishop that you dealt with, and with you being a former stake president and bishop? Do you feel the church kind of left those guys out there to hang where, you know, they wanted to support you, they felt inspired to support you, and yet we talk about the August, where they came out and actually gave some direction on how. We actually looked at that as a positive thing, because we said, finally you have said this is what it is,
Right.
so that you're not leaving these people out there hanging where they say, I feel like I'm doing the right thing, and then it gets overridden, just like what happened with the stake president.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that those guys were kind of left to hang in that matter? Because and do you see it the same way as a positive thing, that at least you've now come out and declared this is what can and can't happen, so that there's no question left out there for the bishop that he's...
Well, I would have to vehemently disagree that there's anything positive about the restrictions that came about on August 19th of this year.
I think by positive, what you're meaning is that it forces nuanced bishops to realize there's no nuance.
Well,
But that's bad, because
it's
before
bad. That's what I'm
bishops
saying.
were allowing
That's
that.
what I'm
Right.
saying. But
Yeah.
now,
Now
if
it's-
there's
you can't.
anything
That's what I'm
positive that you
saying.
could say
Yeah.
about that, it would be the fact that ambiguity is now gone.
That's
it.
what I
he
meant by that.
Yeah.
Especially, you're not
Yeah.
going to make a life decision saying, I hope the church
It might.
is going to
Yeah,
let
it's
me
not
do
going
that.
to, right.
They've now said, no, we're
Right.
not, and
And-
now you can make a life
And the
choice.
result is that the door to the church has been slammed shut,
Yes.
in my opinion.
Yes.
The lock thrown and tape put on the
Mm-hmm.
door.
Yeah.
It's not a safe place any longer for transgender members, and we'll get perhaps more into that in a minute. But
And now
go-
it's obvious.
Going back, and now it's obvious.
Yeah.
You know, let's blow our whistle on that.
Yeah.
But thinking about my stake president and my bishop, those were two gentlemen who responded to this circumstance, the condition of having to deal with me ecclesiastically, in extremely different ways, and I outlined that in the book. My dear bishop, at the time, the one that helped me, that facilitated my coming out to the ward, was released from being bishop early on the day I was excommunicated.
That morning.
Oh,
That
my
morning.
goodness.
And he told me that afternoon, prior to my disciplinary council, that it was because of his adamant support of me as a member and my transition. We found documents that covered the training that stake presidents were receiving from Area 70s during that 2016 timeframe. And it was very clearly written that if an individual priesthood leader didn't fall in line with these directions, they would be released. And so I'm convinced that my stake president had been threatened with his release
I'm sure so.
when he failed to take away my recommend the first time.
Yep.
And that was the circumstance that I inadvertently stepped into as it became my time to come out and transition fully. It was at a time when gender identity and the church's attempts to define their doctrine associated with that were at a crescendo of anxiety for them. They were trying to protect the gender binary of their universities and church schools and so forth, and of other issues, and had written documents to the Supreme Court and so forth, stating that they did not believe that individuals could self-determine their gender identity. And that happened concurrent with me trying to do just that. And as we look back now as historians and say, what was going on at that time period? What was in the minds of the leaders of the church? Well, it was all of this, and why was I treated harshly like I was at that time, when I have, up until the recent restrictions come out, got many transgender friends who have fully transitioned and were holding callings, attending their Relief Society meetings or priesthood meetings, working with
Youth,
children and
yeah.
youth. I have a good friend who was a primary teacher as a transgender person, another one who had callings, and was just a number of folks that were welcome in their Relief Society, because in the 2019-2020 update to the handbook, there was enough latitude there for church leaders, local leaders, bishops and so forth, to use their discernment to make good decisions. From my 20-odd years of working with the church handbook, the best versions of the church handbook were the ones that stated the kind of the absolutes. Here's the doctrine, here's some general policy points, but left a huge amount of latitude for the discernment and basically heart and compassion of local church leaders. the difference with this new policy restriction on transgender members, and what makes it so terribly bad, is it took away that local discernment and closed the door for any trans member to be able to go to their priesthood leader and ask for any sort of accommodation around those restrictions, making the church just plain undesigned not for us.
Yeah, the problem we saw with that is people would go to one ward and they're welcomed, and,
That's right.
and the bishop, then they go somewhere else and they're completely,
And they're
they're like,
excommunicated.
what's going on here?
And that comes out in Laurie's book.
very
Again
unfair.
and again, she talks about the one bishop she was mentioning. She talks about another bishop who's also incredibly affirming and supportive of her. And it's just kind of like bishop roulette, you know. But I love the examples of the positive examples of wards where she's accepted, and leaders who accept her and love her and affirm her for who she is, because it shows how it can be, and it shows how it should be, and it shows it's just not that hard.
It shouldn't be. But, and again, the updates then that just happened, that does shut the door on all of that. So now I feel like local leaders, you need to make a decision now, because you were able to sort of act your conscience before. You could be affirming and inclusive, and now you
can't.
yourself can, it's spelled out right there. That's not the church you're in. If that's the church you were trying to create in your board, good for you, you're a hero bishop. But now you've got a decision to make. So, and I think that's what you meant, is it kind of forces their hand at this point to recognize what they're really
Well,
a
it made
part
everyone
of.
recognize this is what my
This
church is.
They said it out loud. Yeah, that's
They
exactly
put it in writing now.
We've seen many folk in the last 8 weeks since this came out, many who aren't even associated with a transgender family member or friend, who have said, if this is what my church is, we're done.
Yep.
Much like was the case when the policy of exclusion November 5th, 2015 came out. Many people, whether they had folks that they knew or appreciated in their families that had same-sex relationships or marriages, legal marriages, they didn't find Christ-like love in the church any longer, and they left. So I draw the analogy in the afterword, which we wrote after the restrictions came out, that whether it was the church's exclusion policies on race that endured 120 years until 1978, or the church's policy on same-sex marriages that lasted from 2015 on, slightly got rescinded, but not really, or this new policy regarding gender identity and those who transition, using their language, away from their biological sex at birth. What we see is this recurring pattern of discrimination and exclusion against race, minority orientation, and minority gender identity. These are different facets of the same gemstone. And with regard to race, things were changed by revelation, as the story goes. For orientation, it was rescinded, and the worst parts of it were refuted and taken away. With regards to gender identity and minority gender identities, I can only hope that the day will come when these restrictions will be reversed. They don't mean anything to me anymore because I'm not attending my LDS meetings any longer, but I'm deeply concerned for transgender members who are still trying to reconcile their gender identity and their identity as a Latter-day Saint. I'm particularly concerned for young people that are being born into Latter-day Saint families every single day, growing up in the faith tradition of their fathers and finding themselves at some really difficult, sensitive moment in their life within a religion that is definitely not designed for them anymore. It's really designed to get rid of them. The conflict that they're going to face, the pain that they're going to experience, has been magnified factorial number of times. And that is the rub. That's the part that's just tragic, that lives are going to be threatened by innocently growing up in a situation that really expels them. And how many ward leaders, how many parents are going to feel justified in mistreating these gender variant young people? I go so far as to suggest that the way the restrictions are written, that if you appear to have transitioned away from your biological sex at birth, you can be escorted away from activities, that you can be denied the opportunity to participate in certain things. Anyone who knows anything about the current rising generation will recognize that style is very unisex and across the board.
You're right.
But I even think back to my little sister, who in the late 1970s liked to go to high school in men's dress shirts and skinny ties and a miniskirt.
Yeah.
That was her style.
That's the style.
That was her style. And 50 years later, she's never been gender variant in the least. She just liked that style. So what's going to happen now when a unisex or a gender variant appearance youth who isn't transgender at all comes into a ward building, and someone who wants to be judgmental says that person is a problem? We've now created a surveillance policy against people who it never even was meant to be against. And lives are going to be damaged and harmed. Testimonies, as they may exist, are going to be ruined. The families and parents of those young people are going to be thrown into challenge and turmoil. For what? For the comfort of some straight white men?
Well, that's kind of the beauty of this update, in that it is so harsh, and saying it out loud, that people cannot fail to take notice. And I will say that the day that it came out and started to be more publicized, I had, was it 4 or 5? I think 5 people, I didn't know, contact me, just the podcast. One person said, my 16-year-old, I'm going to tear up saying this, but said, can we just be done, Mom? And she said, we can. And she said, I just want you guys to know that we're resigning today. And other people like that contacted us. So I feel like, because it's so blatant and so out loud, and even the parents whose children are not transitioning, but like you said, just want to wear a skinny tie to church. Can you imagine that family being called in by the bishop, and those parents will go, wait, what, my kid? Oh, now I see maybe what happens to some other children. I feel it's going to force the issue. There's going to be collateral damage, but I feel like it's going to let people see what's really going on until it changes. So I don't know.
Unfortunately, the children, whereas you could say, I'm done, and you could walk away, even though it costs your job, children or youth cannot. They're in that home, they're being told you have to go to your youth activity, and they know what's going to happen when they get to their youth activity. What a horrible situation.
I totally love the idea that it's gross enough that it's got to change, but I cannot tolerate young people being collateral damage.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and hopefully most of these young people have supportive parents that are going to stand by their children and love their children and do the right thing by their children. But of course, that's not always going to be
definitely
the case.
Not always the case.
Not always the case.
I know.
How do you deal with the fact that here you were in the office of the church office building, a member of the First Presidency came up and hugged you and reaffirmed you, and then this happens and nobody comes to your rescue, nobody comes to your aid. Do you feel it was genuine? Do you feel it was what had to be done, or that they just more church broke
part of the system?
Part of the system? How do you feel? I mean, that must have been an incredibly spiritual experience for somebody who is in your position, to have that happen and then feel like you were just kicked away a year later or a few months. I don't know how long it was between that.
There were 5 years between those dates. But I wrote an appeal to my disciplinary council, which we all have an opportunity to do within the first 30 days. And I pointed out the great disparities between how that disciplinary council occurred and what is provided in the 107th section in the Doctrine and Covenants with regard to instructions for disciplinary councils and what I was familiar with in the handbooks at that time. But I also pointed out and used a talk that President Uchtdorf had given recently in a general conference, and one I think that may have been Elder Holland. I pointed out that those talks that referred to the importance of diversity within the church, that in my case, they were reducing the diversity of the church intentionally. And what, are we now going to start excommunicating people who don't look like we do, who don't dress like we do, who have different cultural experiences than we have? I spelled all that out and I said, that's not the church that I joined, so many years ago. That's not what I believe the Lord would want his church to be doing, reducing diversity rather than encouraging it, as some of those talks had done. They didn't come to my rescue. And I have strong feelings about the fact that there were legal issues that they were trying to accomplish. So much so that 2 years after my excommunication, the church attorneys, Kurt and McConkie, had written another amicus brief associated with gender identity and sent that off to the Supreme Court. And it included an example. There were 3 examples provided of what the church was trying to gain their loophole to be validated. And the third one of those was a transgender individual sues the church for not being able, I'll say it again, a transgender architect sues the church for being denied the opportunity to work in the meeting house program. And that was so close to my story, my situation, although I hadn't sued the church, but a transgender church architect. I mean, come on, how many of us were there?
Yeah, they're alluding to you, yeah.
Of course, and they were using that my specific experience to try to reinforce their religious bigotry.
I think also pointing out, adding to what Laurie Lee has said, when a member of the first presidency, President Uchtdorf at the time, embraced Laurie and said, "We're so glad you're here," Laurie was feeling transgender at that point, but not acting on it. In other words, she wasn't presenting as female at work.
Right.
And so we've heard that before, right? It's okay to feel these feelings, but not act on them. And so I wonder, we can't be positive, but it's after that Laurie starts saying, I want to fully transition at work as well in my gender presentation. And that's where it starts to become a conflict.
No problem.
So there's a statement I made in the afterword with regard to this. This is on 301.
Everyone get your books out.
Get our
Here we
books
go.
out.
It's just like book club, everybody. Here we go.
You get it on
301.
Amazon. Or
That's right. Everyone get
Mentioning book club. The title is Dictates of Conscience. If you put that into your Amazon, this will pop up. So just to reinforce and maybe punctuate this discussion of the restrictions, at the bottom of 301, I write, the new restrictions apply to any individual who pursues surgical, medical, or social transition away from their biological sex at birth. Biological sex at birth is a definition that fails even to acknowledge the existence of non-binary and intersex persons, and which many federal courts have struck down constitutionally as discrimination based on sex. For individuals who experience long-term gender dysphoria, social, medical, and even surgical transition is the medically proven standard for the treatment of dysphoria. Transgender church members often, as I did, require transition as an intervention to survive and eventually thrive. The emphasis on biological sex at birth demonstrates the church denying the bodily autonomy of transgender members, much in the same fashion that conservative governments and politicians have sought to intrude between doctors, patients, and their families.
I'm so glad that you got the opportunity to write the afterword, honestly, that now that I see it in the context of the entire story, all laid out with all the continuity, and then that brings it all home, which is just amazing.
Punctuation.
That's right. Everybody go like that. Punctuation mark. That's it. So where was your family at during this time going through the excommunication? Were you still married? Were your children? Let's talk a little bit about that, and then kind of sliding on to more positive things that have occurred
Right, because
since.
the thing
We
to
can't give
remember,
away everything, but
the thing to remember is that despite what we've said, Dictates of Conscience
Yes.
has a happy ending.
That's what I'm trying to get at. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. It's important
And
to get through all of it to get there, though.
There are some pretty difficult and sad challenges
Mhm.
along the way, and we've touched on a lot of that, but the happy ending is the fact that I'm still here and that I survived and am thriving and joyfully authentic. Whatever I may have lost along the way, I've gotten back and then some. Reminds you a little bit of the story of Job,
Yeah.
in which Job lost everything as some sort of weird test that he had to go through.
That story's problematic.
Yeah, the story's problematic, but the point is that he ultimately was given 100-fold what he had before, and I feel very much the same way. With regard to my family, as I mentioned, when I came out in 2012, my children mostly were all adults and had partners of their own, were off raising their own families. I was married up through the time of the disciplinary council. We had faced a lot of challenges. My transition was something that was very difficult for my spouse at the time. She didn't handle it well. I've detailed in the book some of the terrible things that happened, just uncomfortable and difficult circumstances. I understand where she was coming from, but I also understand that someone who really loved me probably wouldn't have gone down that road that I experienced with her. The thing was that once I was excommunicated, it removed any moorings to me that she felt, and she chose the church over me. And I respect her, but I had also lost any feeling of devotion to her through that process. And luckily, this is where the happy starts coming in. I do tell the story of how I found the love of my life and moved to Kentucky to be with her. And I will say this, that the best part of living authentically is having someone who loves you for exactly who you are and exactly as you are. And that's what I have with Nancy.
See, it is a happy ending. That's
It does.
wonderful. And there's more detail in the book, of course, but yeah, that's just so happy to hear. Because as you're going through the book and reading it, you're like, oh, let there be a happy ending. You just want that because you just fall in love with Laurie Lee in the book, you know, and just everything that's happening and the whole experience and the whole journey. And so we're so happy that you were able to write all this down and share it with everybody. I mean, I think it's so important. I don't think you know, I think you sense it's important, but I don't think you know how important it is until this comes out.
Yeah.
Which when we drop this episode, it'll probably be either just out a few days or about to come out in a few days. I'm not exactly sure when that'll be, but I think that you won't even have any idea until people start contacting you and letting you know what you've done for them just by sharing your story.
I look forward to all the good that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I recognize there may be some blowback too, but
There always is.
the reality is this is a risk worth taking.
Yeah.
These are the stories that need to be told and people need to understand. Because I was that guy who sat in the church building and said, LGBTQ, what is that? That's a sin. You shouldn't be here. The Lord has said that's a sin. And then I started, I remember when the November 15th policy came out, and I was kind of going, oh, that doesn't quite make sense why a child's being punished. And then I started hearing stories of families and children who couldn't 12-year-old, he turns 12. His dad's gay and married to another man, so he's not allowed to progress in the priesthood, even though the dad wants it, the mom wants it, the kid wants it. And I'm going, how is that right?
Yeah.
And as I started considering that, and at the time I was a youth leader, I was a scoutmaster, I was going, how would I deal with a 12-year-old boy who can't progress, and all his friends are out there passing the sacrament, and he's got to sit there because of a choice of his dad? That's not right. When you start having actual interactions or start putting people in here rather than just thinking of it as a concept, that's when minds get changed. And I think that's what you're doing here is, and this, just this interview for people to get to know you and hear you and see how this impacted your life. That's what changes minds.
Stories make the difference.
Stories make the difference.
And getting to know people individually and learning their great qualities and loving them. One of the secrets of finding a ward that would love me was that I went to that ward and loved them first. And they could not help but love me.
That's beautiful.
To know Laurie Lee is to love Laurie Lee.
There it is. To know Laurie Lee is to love Laurie Lee. And you're not only an author, you also expressed to us that there's a poem in the book, and I read it and I absolutely loved it, and I thought, oh, you must write poetry all the time. And you just told me that no, this was your first attempt. I don't know if you'd be comfortable kind of closing by reading the poem.
Sure.
Would you be all right doing that?
I'd be glad with that.
It was just beautiful, just at the very end of the book, and I think that you need to write more poetry now that I know that you haven't really done that, because this is amazing.
I never considered myself a writer of anything. I would, in elementary school and middle school and even in high school, if I could draw something in place of doing an essay, I would. But as I was working on the memoir and learning how to write that, this poem kind of came out of my pen and felt inspired. I've never read it out loud, so this will be a first. It's entitled My Inner Voice. The innocence of a child found my inner voice, yearning to be seen. The uncertainty of youth longed to live by truth, not allowed to be seen. My inner voice buried. The resolve of a scholar trained to follow my craft, fought to be recognized. The pragmatism of submission discovered my faith, gave myself over. My inner voice chafed. Subject to safety and conformity, identities of profession, religion, success, concealed by truth. The confinement of a prison cell, life's choices made fast the door, and impenetrable the walls, incarcerating my inner voice. Refusing to go unheeded, dogma demanded obedience. My inner voice grew firm. Against the constraints affixed, stripped of friends, family, and appearance, penalties were imposed. My inner voice found expression. With the blessing of healing, my inner voice triumphed. Openly, she loves and lives in joy.
I love that last line. Openly, she loves and lives in joy. You need to write more poetry. That's all I'll say. So, Barbara, why don't you tell us some details about the book, where it can be found, some of the dates again. I know we mentioned it at the top, but let's just make sure everybody, I should have said halfway through, stop watching right now, get on Amazon or wherever it's going to be. But yes, let us know where we can find the book.
Absolutely. So thank you. It will come out for Transgender Awareness Week, particularly Transgender Awareness Day, which is November 20th, so next month. Well, if you're watching this in November, it's coming out soon, November 20th. It's available for pre-sale now, and so if you want to be sure to be among the first to get your copy, go ahead and order it now online, and it will be available in Kindle as well. And we're talking about how to make it work as an audiobook as well. So I think it really needs to be.
Yeah, I think so too. I think you should read it.
You should do it.
And Laurie should read it herself.
You should read it. Yeah,
absolutely.
Nope,
I would love
that. Yeah, so we're
It's
looking
wonderful.
for ways to make that happen. And yeah, it'll be available online and try your local bookstores as well. So
That's great.
yeah, if you want to shop local and support your local bookstore, all you have to do is go to your bookstore and say you want this, and they can order it for you. So really, you can get it anywhere.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be other opportunities that maybe aren't even on the schedule yet to, interact with Laurie Lee or to other podcasts, all kinds of things.
If
She'll be
Laurie Lee
around.
will come back to Utah,
let's hope.
we will
Yeah.
do some signings
Yeah.
at that time. And then, of course, if Laurie Lee wants to schedule things in Kentucky, where she currently lives.
Right.
So yeah, we will be looking for doing
great.
some book signings and some conferences coming up, some Mormon Studies conferences, that kind of thing, having her speak and sign books of those. So
Yeah.
it'll
You're
be
going to be
everywhere.
very busy. Very
going to
busy
be
for the next little while, which is
very
wonderful.
busy.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's, if there was ever an opportunity to let one's light shine,
Yeah, this is it.
This is it.
Absolutely. So,
That's right.
do you have any final thoughts as we close up here and let the trains go ahead and keep running? We've had fun tonight, haven't we? We've tried to cut it out, but if we miss some, that's just us. So.
I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation and look forward to seeing how this turns out.
Yeah.
And all the good that is done by it.
Yep, I think we're just at the beginning of the journey with this, don't we? This has been really good, hasn't it,
Oh,
Landon?
it's been
This has just
fascinating,
been
very
fascinating and
interesting,
incredible. It has. So, well, thank you everybody for staying tuned for this. Even through all the train noise, it's been really fun here. You can kind of hear the rumbling a little bit, but just a great ambiance and a great location and a wonderful guest, and we've had a wonderful time. So please comment and let us know. Again, I'm not sure when this is dropping, so maybe some of you already have the book. If it's right after or right before, I'm sure you're going to go out and get the book, and we'll even include in the show notes some links of some places that you can access it. But as Barbara said, you can pretty much go into any bookstore and say, I've got to have this book. So, and you're going to want to. It's just an amazing book that, as we've talked about, is very much needed, and it's going to make a big difference and a big splash when it comes out. So, but yeah, everybody hold up the book. Here we go. Professional, there we are. So everybody please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell, and it'll tell you if you'd like to donate to Mormonish Podcast. We always have links in our show notes to Donor Box. We are a 501(c), and we appreciate all of you that do it. Really helps us to be able to have wonderful guests and wonderful conversations. I mean, we actually can't believe we get to do this, can we, Landon? The kind of people, it's just, honestly, we have to pinch ourselves sometimes, just the situations that we
feel the same
find
way.
ourselves in, don't you? You're just like, how did this happen? This is just so amazing to be able to do this. So, all right, well, thank you, Landon, for co-hosting, and thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Laurie Lee, and we will see everybody next time on Mormonish Podcast. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.